Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a pretty controversial critique of what's been called academic feminism. We're going to break down some really explosive claims and the evidence the source uses to back them up. So let's get right into it. So, what is this critique really all about? Well, it all kicks off with a story that honestly, it sounds like something out of an academic thriller. We're talking about a fake research paper, a dog park, and a question that really shakes the foundations of how we think about peer review. But hang on, before we get into all the juicy evidence, we have to get the language right. In any debate like this one, the words really matter. So it's super important to understand what the source actually means when it uses the term academic feminism. Okay, so think of it like this. It's like putting on a special pair of glasses. According to the source material, academic feminism is a lens that's designed to bring female oppression into really sharp focus. The critique, though, is that those same glasses end up blurring out or maybe even making invisible the disadvantages and the struggles that men face. So if that's the claim, that this lens creates a totally biased view, then what's the proof? Well, the source's first big piece of evidence comes from this really controversial project that tried to put that alleged bias to the test, in the real world. It's famously known as the Grievance Studies Affair. I mean, just imagine going undercover inside the world of academic publishing. That's pretty much what this team did. Their whole mission was to see if they could get completely bogus, sometimes absolutely ridiculous papers published, just as long as those papers said all the right things to flatter the political views of the journals. And their method? Oh, it was simple, but wow, was it effective. First, they'd find some trendy theory. Then, they'd just make up some absurd data to back it up. Then they'd wrap the whole thing in that fashionable, complicated academic language and send it off to a top journal. They were testing a simple question. In these fields, is it the political packaging that matters more than what's actually inside? So what happened when they sent these Trojan horse papers out into the wild? Well, out of the 20 fake papers they wrote and submitted, an incredible 7 of them were accepted for publication. And get this, some were still being peer-reviewed and praised when the whole hoax was finally revealed. And listen, we're not talking about slightly flawed papers here. One of the most famous ones argued, completely seriously, that we can understand human oppression by watching dogs in a park. This paper, claiming that dog parks are, and I quote, petri dishes for canine rape culture, wasn't just accepted, it was actually praised by the journal's reviewers for its insights. And if you think that's wild, it gets even crazier. Another paper that got accepted was literally a rewrite of a chapter from Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf. All the authors did was swap out Hitler's original targets and plug in terms like privilege and white males, dressed it all up in feminist theory, and sent it in, and it was accepted. Okay, so the Grievance Studies Affair is, a super dramatic example of this alleged bias, but the source's next point is a bit more subtle, but in its view, just as powerful. We're shifting gears now from academic hoaxes into the world of domestic violence research, and a debate that has been quietly raging for decades. Right at the center of this whole debate is the work of Dr. Murray Strauss, who is a huge name in family violence research. For decades, his massive studies kept finding something that just didn't fit the standard narrative, that when it comes to non-lethal physical violence, women actually assault their partners at about the same rate as men. The source's big claim here is that this finding has been actively and systematically buried. Now, according to Strauss, this wasn't just, a healthy academic disagreement. No, he said there was a systematic campaign to silence his research. He even gave it a name, data filtration. He claimed that findings like his were blocked from getting published, that funding would get denied, and that other researchers who dared to agree with him were professionally threatened. And we're not just talking about one guy's experience here. The source argues that this number, over 200, represents the number of studies from all sorts of different researchers that have all backed up this gender symmetry idea. And yet, it argues, this absolute mountain of evidence has been almost totally ignored by universities and, maybe more importantly, by the people who make our laws. So what is going on here? What's driving all of this alleged suppression and bias? The source points to a psychological theory that tries to explain how our thinking about gender can get, really twisted. It's called gamma bias. Okay, so here's how it's supposed to work. Gamma bias does 2 things at once. It magnifies the good things about women and the bad things about men. And at the exact same time, it minimizes the bad things about women and the good things about men.
The source basically describes it as a kind of cognitive funhouse mirror that just completely distorts how we see reality.
And this bias, the source argues, has a huge effect on what our society decides to pay attention to. For instance, we talk a lot about the glass ceiling, those invisible barriers that women face at the top. But this theory claims we almost never talk about the glass cellar, the fact that men make up the overwhelming majority of people in the most dangerous, dirty, and deadly situations at the bottom. Think construction workers, soldiers, homeless people.
Now, obviously, this is a really heated debate, and to be fair, the source does take on the counter-arguments. It identifies and then tries to dismantle two of the most common defenses for the way things are in academia right now. So the first big argument is that, hey, we need this focus on women to correct for centuries of a male-dominated version of history. The source's response? It basically says you don't fix a bias by creating a new opposite bias, and it also argues that history was mostly about elite men, and the suffering of the average working guy was just as invisible as the suffering of most women. Okay, the second counterargument is that any research that questions these ideas is just a form of hateful backlash. The source's comeback here is pretty sharp. It says calling data hate speech isn't an argument, it's a way to shut down the conversation entirely. It argues that when a theory can no longer be questioned with evidence, well, it stops being a science and starts to look a lot more like a religion.
So you might be thinking, all right, this is all just a big fight between professors in an ivory tower, right? Who cares? Well, the source argues that no, this academic debate has very real consequences that actually affect all of us, from our laws all the way down to our culture.
The source is pretty clear here. These theories do not stay in the classroom. They shape the actual laws we live under, especially around things like domestic violence. They influence how our universities handle things, like with Title IX. They literally determine who gets resources when they're a victim of violence. And at the end of the day, they shape the very way our culture thinks and talks about what it means to be a man. And so this all leads to one final big question that the source material leaves us with. A question it seems to think we should all be asking ourselves. When does a tool for understanding the world become a weapon for dividing it? At what point does any theory stop being a science and start becoming an ideology?